What's up, everybody? It's Mike here from The Art of Guitar. I'm really excited about today. We're going to be doing the Beatles guitar techniques, the greatest Beatles guitar techniques. I haven't counted how many there are, but I think there's over 30 in this list. So I'm excited about it because I don't think the Beatles get as much credit. This sounds funny saying that about the Beatles, but for their guitar techniques, I think a lot of it's their songwriting, how they changed the whole world back then in only a few years. If you really look at how long the Beatles were around for, it's probably not as long as you think, and it's pretty amazing that they made that big of a difference in music and the world just in that short amount of time. Real quick, this one has so many techniques that I'm not going to spend very much time at all going in deep. Like I always say, you can go to the website, theartofguitar.com, for all the details on everything. But today is all about showing the techniques for the most part. I'll teach a little bit, but I really want to get through all of them today. And it's pretty late right now. It's like 2 in the morning, so I want to make sure I get everything done before the sun comes up. One thing the Beatles weren't afraid to do was use strange ideas for solos. So sometimes they would just follow the vocal line, sometimes they would do like a simple scale, sometimes they would just do craziness. But for this particular solo, they basically just played a melody line on the low strings, which not a lot of bands do. A lot of people think soloing and they think up high, higher notes. But in this example, they use a really cool melody line on the fattest 2 strings. So the 6th string and the 5th string for the most part. And with the magic of post-production, hopefully I added a guitar to that. So the Beatles weren't afraid to use jazzier chords sometimes, and they would throw them in at really interesting places that you wouldn't quite expect. For example, at the end of one of their songs, they go like this. So quite a few of their songs, they'll end a song on not a typical chord, so not just a major or a minor chord. Sometimes they'll do a major 7, sometimes a 13 chord, but that's just one example. Here's another one. So in that, they had some minor chords, and then there was a G13. Love that sound. Now remember, on the website, we teach about all these extensions and how to add them to your triads to make bigger chords. And then at the end, there's a C, but all of a sudden there's a C7, a dominant 7. Really, that's the sound of the Beatles, in my opinion, the dominant 7 chord. All right, if you ever get a Beatles music book, like a tab book or transcriptions of any kind, you'll notice that on the acoustic guitar, there's a lot of G6 chords in there. And you might go, why is there a G6 chord thrown in all the time between chords? What I realized is that the way John Lennon plays a lot of the times is he'll play a chord, and then instead of just switching instantly to the next chord, let's say C to D, he'll throw in a bunch of open strings. So he'll do something like this. Do you hear the kind of a bundle of open strings? So that's actually a G6 chord if you just hit those open. So whenever you see that in a tab book, remember that that's the John Lennon tendency. So in the next few examples, you're going to hear this. Actually, for a lot of examples, you're going to hear that sort of thing. But I'm not going to mention it. Just realize that that's what John did quite a bit whenever he played rhythm. Okay, so in this tune, we've got triplet strumming. And this could be a little bit tricky for people because we're not used to going like this. Kind of tough to do that, especially when you're changing chords as you're doing it. So I'm going to do a slower version of it just to show you the transitions going on, and realize that John was a really good chord smith, if you will. He was able to play the chords on the higher strings, and he didn't always have to play full chord shapes like sometimes we want to do because we're used to them. So for example, F sharp minor to B major to E major, like this, kind of interesting. Add your pinky, C sharp minor. Move it up, change the shape a little bit, you have A major. Back to F sharp minor. D major by adding the middle finger. And then finally a B7 by adding your pinky. Back home to the F sharp. Now this is where that G6 would come into play, because John would go like this. There's the open G6. Some of them he wouldn't need the G6 because he could go instantly into the next chord. But if there's a big jump, you would hear that. Then from here you don't need it because you can just add the middle finger. And here you don't need it because you just have to add the pinky. And the back home. So that's For All My Lovin'. If you know that song, you'll know that that's the feel of it. Go ahead and try to get those changes in. And realize if you don't know what's going on with these chord shapes, it's because you might not know your cage system chords very well. That's something we like to teach a lot as well. All right, one time I had to play with a Beatles tribute, and this is the solo I had to nail. I was kind of nervous because I wasn't used to playing these type of solos. And what it is, it's double stop soloing that George does in this particular one. It's very interesting. For example, it starts off like this. So it kind of walks up like a bass line, which we're going to cover later. Once you have the chord shape, it's not all about just playing arpeggios. You actually have to play 2 notes at a time with a string in between a lot of the times. So you end up with this. Does that sound cool? So if you add that, it really decorates the sound, and you can call it a solo because it's a solo break. But you don't have to do a lot of moving with the hand if you're going to keep a chord shape and just play the 2 notes with the right hand. Just like that. Now don't get me wrong, there is going to be some moving around because this double stop idea can take you around the neck a little bit. Just keep in mind that there's a lot of theory to this right now that we're not going to explain, but just watch how it decorates the solo section, okay? So it goes. I'm really glad I joined a country band for a while because that's when I got better at Travis picking. That helps so much with these Beatles solos. There was a lot of Spanish influence, especially in the early Beatles stuff. And if you listen to George's solo Until There Was You, it's actually very Spanish sounding. I just love the feel of it. It's kind of exotic. And they're using some diminished climbs. There's a lot of cool things happening. So check it out. So it's really cool when a band has a defining chord sound for a song. And it's kind of cool when this song starts, it starts off with one big chord. And you just know what song it is off that one chord because it's so definitive. There's one type of rotating lick that I really like playing. And the Beatles do this in this song. And it goes like this. I think of it as a circular 3 motion. Like that. You've probably heard that in a few Beatles tunes, but here's the context that that's used in. And by the way, bands like Skynyrd and Zeppelin use this too, so it's kind of a cool thing that you can use in a lot of different situations. A great way to add some drama to your chords, instead of just going like this, do what John likes to do and give it a little double hit right beforehand, so it ends up sounding like this. It's a pretty simple technique once you get that flick of the wrist down, but it adds a lot to your chords, so something that would seem kind of laid back can all of a sudden be very dramatic. To practice that, I like to mute the strings and just give it some hits like that and get used to that double hit in the beginning. The Beatles were not afraid to break a few rules here and there. Now, when it comes to just standard chord theory, when you start learning, you might think that this is against the rules and you're not supposed to use them, but that's exactly why you should use them eventually, because it's fun to break the rules. It creates things that are a little bit more interesting to listen to, a little bit off the beaten path. Here's kind of a simple idea. Take a major chord that's in your song and just make it a minor chord every once in a while. It kind of changes things up a bit. So let's say if we started here, and all of a sudden we went to a minor version of it. So here's an example in the song called I'll Be Back, which is one of my favorite Beatles tunes. Isn't that cool? When I go around the big circle, we go back to major, but then when they start to sing, they go to the minor. It's a very interesting sound. By the way, this happens in Nowhere Man as well. So you're in E, goes to B, to A, to E, F sharp minor, to A minor this time. A lot of people think you can't do that. Like if you use an A major in a song, they think you have to use it for the whole thing. But go ahead and do what the Beatles did, break the rules once in a while. So here's another example of something that might trip you up a little bit. You might think it's against the rules to do this. Works great in a Beatles tune. So we're going to take a 1 chord, which is D. And then our 2 chord's actually going to be E major. So that's kind of a Beatles sound. Major 1 chord, major 2 chord. Then we go to the 4 chord. Back to the 1 chord. So it's kind of strange. Usually in songs, the 1 chord's a major and the 2 chord's a minor. This is what it should sound like if you followed major chord theory right off the bat. But the Beatles make that 2 chord a major. It's kind of their sound, and you get something very interesting. To me, it always sounds like it wants to come full circle when you hit that 2 chord. Wants to come back home, but in a different way than you're used to. So you may have been familiar with that last tune, 8 Days a Week. Well, the beginning, there's a really interesting thing happening. Chords basically being played as triads, but the open E string's ringing out over all of it. So check this out. This will be a D over an E string. Then we're going to move the triad up, so it's E over an E string, so that makes sense. Then we move it up to the G, so now G with the E ringing at the top. And then back home to the D. So it colors the triads in a really great way. It's a great intro for a song. Here's a lick that I believe George had trouble with in the studio. I can see why. If you don't have the right way to pick this, it could be kind of brutal to play. But it goes like this. Now I'm sort of doing the Travis picking country version. I don't think that's what he does. Maybe he does that. You could also alternate pick it. That's kind of difficult because going that fast across the strings can be a little bit difficult for some people. You could do all downstrokes. I don't like that way because you have to get back to the beginning and then just start strumming down. And the last option that I can think of is do an upstroke for the first one and downstroke for the rest of them. That one might seem the weirdest, but I'm finding that that works pretty well whenever you have to go across multiple strings in a sweeping motion. Something you don't hear in a lot of songs are quarter note triplets. So if you're counting 1, 2, 3, triplets would be 1 da 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 da. Sounds kind of tribal. But the Beatles utilize this in a really great way, just in the beginning intro arpeggio that they do. Doesn't it catch the beat in a great way? Instead of going like this, which would be more of a straight way to play it, they're going. Since Paul McCartney was such a big driving force in the Beatles, I realize a lot of his bass lines are utilized in the guitar part as well. So you might hear the bass and guitar mimicking each other for some parts, for rhythms. And here's a great way to do that. If you're in D, for example, let's take the first 3 notes of the major scale. Reach up to the 5. Remember, the intervals are very important. We teach them all on the website. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go there, check them out. Okay, so we have this. Root notes, 2nd, 3rd, 5th. And then you just put it in a great rhythm. That's a fun way to dress up a chord. Let's say if you're just going like this. Throw this in. But the way they use it in this song, they actually move to different chords. So they start off with D, then they go to G. See, it's the same shape, so it's kind of easy. Michelle has to be one of their most musical guitar songs that I could think of. And there's a part where they go to a diminished chord. And there's a really great slide that happens. Now, if you don't know this about diminished chords, if you take a diminished chord, you could bring it up a minor third. You could think of it as moving up 3 frets, 1, 2, 3, and you'll end up with the same chord, just a different combination of these notes. So it's like a different inversion of these notes. You could move it up again. You can just keep going if you want to. But the way they use it in Michelle is they go like this. Not exactly, but that's the concept. Same with diminished licks. So if you ever do any kind of like Yngwie Malmsteen type stuff where you're doing some sort of... See, I just moved it up 3 frets and it worked. You just keep going and it sounds pretty awesome. All right, the famous Dorian solo in the Taxman song, where I believe Paul plays this solo. Could be wrong, but I believe that's true. Now listen how using a mode in a solo can actually change the whole sound. So it's not just a typical minor or a major sound. It's one of the most erratic solos I've ever heard, and if you listen to the song, it just kind of jumps out, does its thing, and then goes away. It comes back later, but... So the D string is sort of acting like a pedal tone, but as you're playing around with it, you could hear that Dorian sound come out. Remember, Dorian's a minor with a raised sixth, so it'll sound like this. There's that sound. Which, by the way... So when I slide down... There's your Dorian sound right there. One of my favorite trippy Beatles tunes, Tomorrow Never Knows, has this backwards guitar sound. The whole song sounds like it's kind of backwards and all over the place. But the guitar part in particular is really interesting to me. They use this backwards guitar effect in a few songs, but in this one it's really effective in my opinion. And to do it, what I'm using is just a line 6 delay pedal with a reverse function in it. But it's fun to mess around and see what sounds good in reverse and what doesn't. So I actually took it and flipped it around in Pro Tools and listened to it. And I'll show you kind of what they were doing. So forward, it was kind of licks like this. It was sort of pentatonic based, like and they did a lot of stops like that. So it's kind of funny. It kind of sounded reverse just forward, but then when you reverse it, it goes like this. As you know, when things are backwards, it sounds subliminal or something. Kind of like if I said, see, it works. All right, get out your light picks for this one. If you're playing acoustic, one thing that John does really effectively, I believe John did this, when he starts his song, I'm Only Sleeping, there's a great backwards rake that he does with E minor chord. And that's where you take your pick, and let's just put it on the high string, and we're just going to rake it backwards. We're going to hold the chord with the left hand and watch the right hand. Every time I do that, if it's a new student, they always think that's the coolest sound. It's sort of that Spanish thing once again, with a minor chord. So a great way to start a song, especially if you're going to go right into strumming afterwards. Okay, there's a specific Beatles finger picking pattern that you should learn. So what we'll do is we'll start off with a D chord. By the way, I did drop D tuning. That's where you take your E string and bring it down to D. So do that before you get started. Now, the general rule for finger picking that I like to follow is my thumb takes care of the big 3 strings, and then my index finger will take care of the 3rd string, middle will take care of the 2nd, ring will take care of the 1st. So you're going to see me doing that quite a bit with this. So the pattern goes like this. The thumb will play the 5th string, while the ring finger plays the 1st string. Just like that. Then we fill in the middle a little bit. Watch what happens. So I went thumb and ring finger, then I went to the middle 2 strings and I went thumb, index finger, like that. So if you put it together, you get that. Now what we do is we take our thumb and we play the 6th string by itself, and then our middle finger will play the 2nd string. So I know it's getting a little confusing because now the thumb's moving around a lot, but watch what happens if you go really slow. Now, on top of what I taught you to do, the thumb actually comes back at the end and hits the 4th string. Very important for it to do that. That way it has this really great walking sequence that it has to do. I'm going to play it almost full speed. Just watch the thumb the whole time. Once you can get your thumb to do that, it's like having a bass player playing with you. It's great. And once again, going back to that Spanish idea, they'll even use it for an entire intro. There's something really great about the way the Beatles did descending chords. And when I say that, sometimes I mean they'll keep the same chord, but there's going to be something about it that's descending. And a good example of that is the chords in While My Guitar Gently Weeps. So if you're familiar with that, you know you start with A minor, but then there's a G underneath that. There's one of the descending parts right there. And that wasn't a half step, that was a whole step descension there. And then the middle finger comes up, leaves its post, and creates this D. They call it a D9 over F sharp. I call it the Radiohead chord. I just know it from Karma Police. And then F is the final chord of that part. We have A minor. We add the G as the bass note. F sharp as the bass note. And then just an F chord. I actually like to use my thumb for that version of it, the Jimi Hendrix. That way you're going from this to that. It's not that big of a difference. And then you can go right back home to the A minor. The song Something also has that vibe where you're in C major. Then you release the index finger, creating a C major 7. See, it's walking down. Then a C dominant 7. You have the pinky on the B flat. So really the high notes go like this. That's the sound it's doing. So here's what we have. There's the C. There's the B. There's the B flat. And then when they do go to the A, they end up with the F chord again. It seems to be their go-to chord for the end of those dissensions. So I believe it was Eric Clapton that played this solo in While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And he does this really great weeping sound with the guitar. And a lot of it's just rocking out in A minor, but you get this nice... So if you ever tried to make your guitar cry before, you can use a wah pedal, that helps too. But the way Clapton's doing it in this song is you're bending the note and then you're vibratoing it, if I can use that term. And as you're doing the vibrato, you're releasing the bend. So it sounds like a weeping, like a crying type thing. What I want you to do is mess with different levels of that. So try to keep doing vibrato even if you're up here and down here. So keep it going, all right? Let's slow it down a little bit. Now it's flat, it's coming back up. The Beatles were not afraid of dissonance, and in Helter Skelter you can really hear that right off the bat. This is pretty heavy for the time. It goes like this. Here's a great concept. Follow the vocal with the guitar and play it like you would a lead part. Makes for a great blues line. And then John sings over the top of that to match it. I don't know who matched who, but either way, it turned out to be a great line, especially when there's the harmony. That always caught my ear, that little... And on the recording, he decides to hit the high harmony with his voice, which blew my mind. All right, of course, we have to talk about Blackbird. And the two things I love about Blackbird are these, I call them spread thirds. They're third intervals, but they're not right next to each other like this. They're spread out across the fretboard, so you get this sound. Sort of a chili pepper sound, if you're familiar with our lesson that I did on John Frusciante. That's in there. But what Paul does is he adds the open G, so that becomes what's called a pedal tone. So we're in G, actually. But if you keep hitting the G string in between each one of these, you get a very interesting sound. One of my favorite Beatles songs to play. One time I had to play it at a wedding for about 20 minutes straight. A song a lot of guitar players like to play is Here Comes the Sun. And I really like how he takes basic chord shapes, capos it by the way at the 7th fret, and really dresses them up. So instead of just hitting a chord, there's a lot of this going on. Hear how the melody comes out in that too? So it shows that whatever chord you're playing, the melody's hiding in there. Just a few little moves sometimes is all it takes. So for songs like A Day in the Life or Help, you'll notice that the rhythm of the acoustic guitar is interesting because it's not just this. It's not full strums the entire time. What they're really good at doing is utilizing each chord and breaking it in half, kind of like a piano player can play both hands, low and high. Well, with the chords, you can also do the same thing. You just have to strum the low strings and the high strings separately. So you get this back and forth kind of balanced rhythm sound. If you go like this. Like when you're a kid and you hear those people singing kid songs, usually the rhythm is like that. And what that does is it allows the guitar to sound like it has a bass player actually playing with you. Helps a lot. Low, high, low, high. Switch to another chord. So that's a good idea. Whenever you're doing your chords, let's say you're doing G, C add 9, D. Maybe try going like this. You should really get to know all of your shapes around the guitar. That way you can play up high, know your notes as well. And instead of doing full chords all the time, you can just do little triads. That's a lot of fun when you're just basically trying to do a second guitar part. So for example, instead of doing an entire chord, you could also do something like this. Kind of like what John was doing when he was doing the fast triplet strums like we talked about early on, but we're breaking it up into an arpeggio pattern this time. This can be gold in the studio when you just need that one more part to go over the top of what's already happening. George Harrison really got into slide guitar, and it's a great technique to add. I have never really dedicated myself to it, but in the last 5 years I've really grown to love slide guitar. And so in the beginning of Free as a Bird, I was really excited to hear him play this part. It's real simple, but it's really effective. Always makes me sad because I think of the video and John Lennon doing the demo and how he's not here, or George anymore, and it's kind of emotional when I play that. There are some really cool hammer-on riffs that the Beatles do, and one of them goes like this. And I love those hammer-ons because it gives it sort of a riding, bouncy kind of feel. You'll also hear that in Paperback Writer. One of my favorite all-time Beatles riffs, as well as this one. If you listen to Come Together, the guitar is doing a subtle thing, but it's a hammer-on trick again. And the bass, of course, is doing the iconic. One of those not-so-uncommon moments when the bass is doing something cooler than the guitar in the Beatles song. If you've seen our Jimi Hendrix video, you'll remember that idea of taking two notes and hammering on one of the strings but not the other. So you get this really great sound out of it. And you can think of it as this. Your root note is E in this case. We're moving up and we're going to play the second interval and the fifth interval at the same time. But we're not going to play that second for very long because we're going to hammer onto that third interval while holding the fifth interval. So it's a little bit tricky. See how you have to skip over that fourth string in order to not interfere with the fifth interval? Well, if you use that idea and move it around, you get this great sound that they use in Don't Let Me Down. favorite Beatles riffs of all time is basically just outlining a dominant chord. Remember I said before that that's the sound of the Beatles? So if you take a D7 and a C7 and you dress it up a little bit, you get this. Okay, at the end I went to G7. So it's D7, C7, G7, all dominant chords. And they just mess around with it a little bit and make it more interesting, and that's the sound you get. But keep in mind, it's just dressing a dominant 7 chord. Before I knew that, I didn't realize it, so I was thinking the riff was way harder than it was. I mean, it is hard to stretch and everything, but if you just keep in mind the basic idea underneath it all, it makes way more sense. Kind of like when you play Day Tripper. This riff... it's got to be a little more trebly for that song. You notice, if you think of an E7 chord, it's outlining that. There's the root to the major third, 5th, octave, flat 7. See, it's all in there. So that song is just all dominant chords, even the B7. That one's always the tough one, though, because you got to move around a lot for that. Pentatonic is a big scale for the Beatles, and they use it blatantly sometimes, in a good way. So, for example, in the Let It Be solo, all C major pentatonic, but used in a very creative way. But you could see it's very boxy, very pentatonic. I love that slide at the end. That's just so crazy. But that's another example of just straight pentatonic licks. Also in Get Back. I love that. A little bit of that country sound that seemed to creep up once in a while in the Beatles. And a great way to base an entire song off of one chord. Let's say if you take D, capo at the 2nd fret, and you just add to it. Watch what they do. That's what I would call a pedal tone chord, because the D is underneath all of that. It's kind of like a bagpipe or something, where there's just this droning D, and over the top is one of the most classic riffs of all time, utilizing one chord. Okay, everybody, that was a lot of techniques. I know we just blew through them, but I wanted to showcase them for you. Thanks for watching. We have a lot of artist series coming up still, a lot of lessons, challenge solos, practice alongs, all that good stuff we're putting up at the main website. So check out our main website for all that stuff, but YouTube will keep giving you some fun stuff now and again. So once again, thanks for watching. Like I said, the Beatles were a huge influence on my life, one of the biggest. If you looked around my room, you'd just see Beatles stuff everywhere. So I guess that's it. We'll talk to you guys soon and see you at the next lesson. Okay.